Pragmatism. Anyway, here's Directorpiece Theater.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Adam.
Hey.
Adam.
Hey, me.
You think we should be worried about the guy who intros us? Probably shouldn't even think about it.
His life is very, it's getting worse. It seems like it's getting a lot worse.
Yeah, maybe we should talk to someone. I don't know. Anyway, as he said, this is Directorpiece Theater. This is a show where two directors basically examine different movies and discuss the bag of tricks of the movies and why they're pretty good movies. Probably sleeper hits. Do you want to add anything to that, Adam?
No. I love describing how a thing's a sleeper hit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's basically that's the gist. And so we typically take an episode, and this is an Adam episode. But I'm Abe Epperson, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined with Adam. Introduce yourself.
I'm Adam Ganser, and this is an me episode.
And it's a him episode. And what I mean by that is he's going to basically tell us a theory today about a film that he recently watched. And yeah, take it away, man. What are we talking about today?
Right. So today's episode is about the movie The Descent. A movie I've seen only 3 times now. I watched it twice for this, and I'd seen it once
That is higher
before.
than I thought you would have seen this movie.
See,
it's not a Adam film in my head.
Not at all. No. And I try to pick things that aren't Adam films for this, because I think it's more fun for me to like think like a director with a film I wouldn't normally watch. Mm-hmm. You know, this one though, this is like a shout out to our boy Julian, because he's the guy that introduced me to this film, and he loves it. And I was watching his Instagram stories, and I was like, oh yeah, The Descent, I should watch that again. And
that's hilarious.
And content was born. You know,
Go on.
The origin story of content. That's what you're here for.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. That is the appropriate statement of acclaim for this movie, Abe. Thank you.
Yeah.
Because the movie The Descent is a story of 6 women who, as presumably sort of a yearly gathering / an exercise in group mourning, decide to take a trip into an unexplored cave network. Although they think it's an explored cave network, it turns out it is not. And they get trapped down there, and things go worse than that. It's
Yeah, pretty dark, dude. It's a dark film.
It's very dark, but it's also not. It's not like a spooky supernatural kind of dark. It's like a tension dark, I would argue, even though there are monsters in this. Right?
Yeah, it takes a while for the monsters to get here.
Yeah, and I have a little thing I want to say about the monsters, but so this movie is widely considered one of the better horror movies. It's kind of endured. It's had a sequel, and it's sort of, there's a little bit of a cult following to it. Like, people get pretty pumped about it. It's an English film, which is a thing that I think is interesting. And my thesis about it is that The Descent is a movie that shows how practical directing decisions, like decisions that a director makes based on practicality, can actually make a film rise in artistic prowess. In this case, it's the pragmatism that made it an artistic success. Go ahead.
Yeah, I watched it, and that was my takeaway as well. So I'm glad we're kind of simpatico in that. I'm surprised you didn't start off with, how much do you know about Neil Marshall, the director of the film?
I don't know a lot about him. I do know that he directed the most recent Hellboy, which was a mixed reviewed film.
Yeah, it was nominated for a Golden Raspberry, actually, for the worst director. So
well,
good on that.
Yeah.
No, he's actually just a little, because I've actually been following his career a little bit, because he's done a few things that I've gone like, oh, all right, you
piques your interest?
You're not bad. Yeah, you pique my interest. And this film definitely was the first one that did that, being like 2005, I think. Recently, we watched on our movie night, we watched Doomsday, which is a wild film, and I suggest anyone who's into like apocalypse, movies, look into it. He is probably most famous beyond his film career is his television career.
Right.
Because he basically was one of, like, Alex Graves was another. There was like 3 main directors for the most seasons of Game of Thrones.
Right.
That did the big episodes. Like, he did Blackwater and Watchers on the Wall, and both of those are basically long, continuous fight scenes. He also did, like, Constantine, Hannibal, Westworld, the new Lost in Space on Netflix. Like, so when you say practicality, he clearly works on stuff that, like, he stretches his money.
Oh, definitely.
Really effectively, really well.
Like,
and
he's a good example of what mastering the craft means. As a director, like when we venerate directors, we're often talking about sort of vision, and I'm going to put that in quotes. When a person sort of has a way of looking at a thing that we haven't seen before, or can tell a story in a way that feels new or original or whatever, but that's not actually what makes a director good at their job. Like, that's not actually the craft. That's more the artistry that's built on the craft. And this guy, at least in this movie, is a very solid craftsman. And we're going to talk a little bit about a few things that he does and why they
I want to
make
know
this
what you
movie so
mean
good.
exactly by that. So let's dive in.
I know. I like it. I can see that you both agree and also are like, but I'm still going to stab you. I got a sword ready for you.
You know me, baby.
I know you.
It's always with the swords.
Embrace me with one hand, stab me with the other.
No. I think this is actually a great topic, and I'm really excited to hear what your take on it is.
Thank you. Yeah.
Because I think I find you, sir, a practical director, a pragmatic.
Yes. Often.
Type.
Often. That's true. I do, especially at Cracked. There was a lot of times where I would make decisions that were basically like, okay, what is the thing that makes this clear? And like, that's the decision we would make. And I rarely would make a decision that was purely for like flourish, because we didn't have a lot of money, so I wouldn't do that stuff. And usually I would build a project around 1 or 2 specific things that were like, this is the big flourish moment.
Like set pieces, if you will.
Right.
Not necessarily like a space. Like in some features, a set piece is sometimes like the big sequence at the stadium or something like that. We had to find set pieces that were like the game we're playing and the polish of the sketch is X.
Right.
You know,
like I need it to be clear. I need to not get in the way. That's a thing that you often talk about, which is sort of directorial transparency. Like a director who doesn't get in the way with a lot of like clever shit. Which this director is very good at that. But also, like, I would so a good example, just so everybody understands, is like people who remember our work at Cracked, is like Starship Icarus was a series that I directed, and when I was designing this, I basically designed it around the first episode has to be the most action heavy, and we're going to build the set so that I can fly through the window. So we're going to do, that's the one big thing we're going to do in this show, is we're going to actually fly through the window once. And so we had to build the set accordingly. And it was a pretty big undertaking and there were some compromises along the way, but essentially like that was the big expense.
And we didn't do a lot of builds.
No. We never built stuff. We built that and then Galactic War Room, and I don't even know if we ever built another set after that, did we?
I built Dr. Sewer's Halloween one.
Yeah. That which I liked.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Right. So building a set, which we're going to talk about a little bit today, building a set means that you're designing around some very specific decisions. So before I don't want to get in the weeds too deep yet. The reason I chose this film is because I wanted to do an episode that was a little bit more just sort of like, why does this work? Like just sort of taking it apart and doing the watchmaker theory. And to do that, I think you have to sort of acknowledge a few things about The Descent. And that is that it's not like a perfect movie at all. It's not a perfect movie. So I'm not holding it up as like, wow, this thing's amazing. It's not. It's not The Shining. It's not even It Follows. Like, it's not that good. But it's like a pretty solid movie. But there are some things that are not great from the directing in it. For instance, I think the acting is kind of spotty here and there. Did you feel that way when you watch it?
I thought it was very subdued. I thought that some of the performances, as is true with an ensemble cast, I didn't get as much of a great picture of each of the characters as I wanted, because it's also a horror film.
Yes.
So you kind of present them and then you start knocking them down like flies.
Correct.
It's kind of asking. It's a type of movie that's both a horror film, but it's kind of asking you to fall in love with some of these characters.
It wants you to be like, oh, that's what would happen to Holly. You know what I mean? It wants you to think that. But I don't think that.
And it's also because it's why I think horror films often deal with like very available archetypes.
Yes,
because they want to just be like, yeah, that he's like the nerd type, or he's like the jock type.
Right.
No. If there's any form of density or continued integrity of that, like, oh, I'm a jock, but I also have this, aspect of my personality or whatnot. It's usually uses it as a launch point, and it's. It's not that they're always one-dimensional, but, it's like a tried and true archetype of a character, and that's, I think, why they do that, because they know that they want us to feel like at any time any one of these people can go.
Right. It's shorthand. It's so that they don't have to do the work. But, like, to contrast, if you really wanted to do a great job with understanding each of these characters, this would have been like an anthology or something. Because it's very hard to know. You just need more time. Right, these are all sort of similar women in terms of age, in terms of ethnic background. Like, it's hard to tell them all apart with one sort of 10-minute sequence where we meet them. That's tough. But that's what he did, and so I think the movie does suffer a little bit because of that, particularly when we start to meet the monsters. Like, one of the major turning points in the movie is a character sprints down a cavern to get out of a they're trapped in this one cave area, so she runs into the light in another one, which causes her to plummet 30 feet down and break her leg, and it's like, well, then she's toast. And it's one of those things where you're just like, none of these people would ever do that. Like, I can't even imagine how that could happen.
Right.
And
right.
The movie, because it's so short on time, basically reduced this woman to bad decision-making adrenaline junkie, and so we don't feel like man. Like, instead you're like, all right, like, you feel a little skeptical about it, and that's not great. There are movies that do this successfully, but most horror movies have this problem when they have like 5 or 6 people. That's not great. They also. There's some writing problems in it, too. The two that really stand out to me that I think are worth mentioning are that it hangs on 2 inconvenient things. One is remembering a look between Juno, who's sort of the antagonist figure, and Sarah's husband, and being like, oh, something's up there. Like, you have to really remember that, because it's like an undercurrent for the whole movie. And I don't know that really works. That's the first thing. And then the other load-bearing thing that kind of doesn't really work is Juno, in the midst of stabbing a bunch of cave goblins, accidentally stabs one of the 6 women and doesn't quite kill her. She sort of lives for about an hour after that, although she's stabbed, like, in the throat.
In the throat with a pickaxe,
pretty
and it's
tough.
An accidental death, but then then Juno doesn't deal with it very well. She lies about it, and
she lies about it, but it's also one of those things where, like, anybody could have understood how this happened. Like, it wasn't it wasn't suspicious at all that she did that. It was like
she had just been like killing a crawler, and it's like, this is otherworldly. I'd be in crazy predator prey mode.
I think and I think even
you can see yourself doing this because happenstance and accidents, and it's one of those unforgivable things. And I think this is the part of the pitch that made this movie get made. Yes,
yeah, probably.
It's the thing that makes this movie really.
It's the hook.
It really, yeah.
I agree. I mean, hook. But it also, I think, doesn't work. I don't think it's great. I think that part, which is, again, the part in the boardroom that people get really sexy for, is like that hook moment, and I would say that the hook doesn't really work in this movie.
You don't want to fuck that moment as much.
Not really. The premise of it, the situation, to me is enough. It's an excellent situation for a horror movie. Like, it is an incredible section, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But so those two things, I think it's safe to say, like, they don't really work, and that is the director/writer's fault. So I'm not saying that this is excellent, but it still works because the director makes some very simple decisions about clarity. So for instance, the premise, as we were just saying, the premise is a can't lose horror movie idea because they're trapped in a dark place. It's like, that is the perfect situation to make a horror movie in, and somehow hadn't really been made. They hadn't really made a movie like this before, which is crazy. And so that alone is like, on a fundamental level, as long as the director is competent, this is going to be a good movie. So there's that. But also, he makes some practical decisions about how to tell this story within that context that are simple, but they also really make it sing. So I'm going to dive into a few of them. To do that, I'm going to get a little technical. And so I want to make sure that if there's ever a point where I'm not clear about something technical, Abe, make sure you jump in and get it clear for everybody. Thank you. Because the first one is actually the hardest one to understand. And that is, this director is very good and very practical with his choice of lenses. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of lenses and like lens length that you use to tell a story in a movie. The best way to understand this concept, by the way, if any of you are trapped at home, let's say, is go watch the first sequence of Indiana Jones, the very first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and watch the moment where Indiana Jones is running away from the tribesmen, right, the tribal figures, and he's trying to get to the plane, and it's, Jock, start the engine, right, just that whole scene. Because that is the scene that I watched in film school to learn this concept. One of the things that you'll notice about it is that it's very hard to tell how far away the tribal people are from Indiana Jones. Because what's happening is Steven Spielberg is cutting between two very different lens lengths. So, for instance, he's using what you might call a wide-angle lens when he shows the overheads or the big wides of Indy running away from the tribal people. And they seem like they're, like 200 yards away, right? They seem very, very far away. Then he'll cut to a telephoto or long lens, and suddenly Indiana Jones is running over a hill, and it seems like he's not moving very fast, and the tribesmen are like literally, it seems like inches behind him, like feet behind him. You're like, oh my God, they're right on his tail, right? And so you don't know, because he's intercutting between those two different lens lengths, you don't really know how far away they are. And that's an intentional decision by Steven Spielberg. And it's a good example of the two kinds of lens lengths that I wanted to compare. So the first one is the wide-angle lens, which is the one that Spielberg uses to tell sort of the big, wide football field length shot of Indy running from them.
And I love just a bit on this.
Sure.
It's also the way in which Spielberg mixes them is a kind of like that's a guy who understands palette of lenses
very much.
And what I mean by that is that he's using the lenses as like a brush to paint the image that he wants you to see, but he also understands that he just came from like, in terms of like when you watch him going into the cave and exiting in the ball sequence and stuff like that, he is already in a wide angle or a wide lens format. Like he's shooting everything on like a 25. So the beginning of the film, you've been in this wide world. It would be super jarring to all of a sudden show that shot of like looking over the hill where he's running at camera, kind of like a Monty Python bit, and they're all watching, and like you said, you can't see the difference between them. But because he kind of preempts it by like jumping back into the longer lens formats, like he kind of gets us ready for it. And I think that that's something that's not trivial. I think that that's intentional.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you're bringing this up. I think you're right.
He's
I
so
think that
good
Descent
at
does this a little bit.
Yeah. He's so good at that. Like that's again one of the reasons why Spielberg is potentially the greatest director we've ever seen, but certainly one of them. Is that he can very quickly and easily make huge decisions, like jumps between like styles like that, and it works. And you don't question it. Most movies and most filmmakers do not make that kind of a decision. In fact, in recent years, we've seen a lot of films get shot with like basically a very limited, specific lens palette. So like movies like The Revenant or Birdman. Or basically all those Iñárritu films, they are all shot on what we would call a wide lens, right?
Super wide.
Yeah, very wide lens. So a wide lens, the way it works is it gives us like a larger field of view and a wider depth of field, which means a lot more elements remain in focus in the picture. Right, so it's not one of those. It's not one of those lens lengths where it's like a very soft, out of focus background. It feels a little bit closer to human vision. And it has a lot of different effects. One of the things that you often use wide-angle lenses for is to sell camera moves, because you feel camera movement, particularly movement that's going straight at or away from the subject. You feel those moves a lot more dynamically when they're on a wide lens. Whereas if you were moving directly toward an object on a long lens, you would not feel that move as much, which is why the Indiana running over the hill part works, because it's on a long lens. So that's what a wide lens is.
Now,
Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. I am going to be a dick.
I love this already. I'm so excited.
Technically, it depends. It has to do with the formula. It has to deal with how the glass.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's f-stops, but that's true with both types of lenses. The discrepancy, though, is that wide lenses, the closer you get, the more I guess narrow focus in terms of depth of field will turn into pinpoint.
Right.
Like if you take like a very wide lens and focus to the closest minimum focus, that could be on some lenses like a millimeter. Less true on longer lenses. So it definitely depends on where the subject is, but you're right. If it's anywhere in like the normal focal plane, like 15 feet, depending on the lens, you're going to see everything a lot more in focus.
And for our lay people, so that we don't get, because you and I both agree that we don't want to get like super like, and then you got to get the right lenses like Zeiss's and primes, right? Nobody wants to talk about that, right? So like, just for
what is this, the Glass podcast? Oh,
hey,
you're hearing the hits here from a episode.
That's a $300,000 joke right there, baby.
Making lens jokes. Come on. Right.
No, so just for the layperson, I want you to have like really obvious movies and images in your brain to compare them. So I would use The Revenant or Birdman, movies that have like very wide angle. Yeah. Lenses, because again, what happens is you can see a wider angle of view, so more actual background, if you will, and more of that will be in focus. And when you get really close to the subject, sometimes you'll see what's called warping, like almost like a fisheye lens, right? But not quite.
And vignetting.
Yes. Yeah. If you want another example of this, you can go watch the series Rom.com. Because I shot, especially season 2, I shot on a very wide lens. And season 2, I really committed to it. It was like I basically only shot on like a 25. And so sometimes What's that? Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, I'd say wide is like a pretty, like most filmmakers in the feature racket
now
are.
Yes, currently.
Now, yeah. I mean, because it's been a traditional TV thing. It's a commercial thing to shoot telephoto because you want to flatten the space. So you just are working with a 2D image, essentially. But, like Wes Anderson, Spielberg, like Tom Hooper, Stanley Kubrick. I mean, these guys are all wide-angle lens guys
They are.
for life.
That
you
is
know?
correct.
And they also seem to be like some of the more prolific and interesting filmmakers as well. I don't know what that correlation is or if it's even involved, but it definitely makes good pictures. I'll give it that.
It adds to the feeling of scale and scope it's another thing to say about it. Okay, so I think we understand what wide lenses are. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we might call long lenses or telephoto lenses. So long lenses or telephoto lenses are essentially when you are creating a narrower depth of field or shallower depth of field and a narrower field of view, meaning you're seeing less of the you're seeing less subject, less background, and you have less range of subject that's going to be in focus, which then creates that feeling of a soft, out of focus background. And what happens is, because you're on a longer lens, you end up sort of compressing objects in 3D space together so that it feels a little bit more like a flat painting. A lot of filmmakers have used that to their advantage. One of the more famous examples of it is actually Stanley Kubrick's movie Barry Lyndon. Barry Lyndon, he used a lot of telephoto lenses to create the feeling of being in a flat picture. There's a lot of flat pictures, like almost like photographs, and he created that by using a long lens. The very first Hunger Games movie, as I recall, was shot on a pretty long lens too. It sort of created what you might call a more poetic look to it, and they kind of abandoned it after the first movie.
It was also in like the mid to late 2000s.
It was everywhere then. Yes,
we had people fall in love with telephoto for a while, and that happens. That's just trends of movie making. Someone made it, and I think it might be Nolan did a lot of it. In like Batman Begins. Like there's a few movies that become zeitgeisty, and other filmmakers take the nod and run with it.
That's 100% true, and I can't name exactly where it started. What began that trend, but it was definitely the thing for a little while. There are movies that I remember that were very much based around the telephoto lens. Like there's a movie called Roger Dodger that I remember being really telephoto. Can you think of any others offhand that are like, oh yeah, that one's like super telephoto?
No, but think of it as the best way I think of it is like. You know how in movies fairly recently, like there's, like think Marvel movies, like why is it all of a sudden that we decided that like things should be very orange or amber key light, and also very like cyan or teal, like because the color contrast between those two colors are very effective because they're literally opposite on the color wheel. We chose some movie did that, and for like a decade we decided that we're gonna light movies that way, and so it gave it this effect, it gave it this look, and it's that kind of trend that I think you're talking about. But I can't think of like long lens movies of recent note.
I think I want to say Collateral is a movie that has a lot of telephoto lenses in it because of all the taxi driving scenes. Anyway, so
I know there's older ones. You think of like Robert Altman and like Nashville or something.
Yes, there you go. There you go. But it comes and goes. It comes and goes.
Yeah.
So
nothing really recently. No.
Now I don't want to say. So again, so everybody understands the concept. So when you're on a telephoto lens, what happens is it compresses the space, right? So it makes it feel like there's less distance between a thing that's like, say, 50 yards from camera and a thing that's 100 yards from camera. It's going to sort of compress those two things so they seem much closer together. Again, see the Indiana Jones exhibit when he's running over the hill. That's what a long lens does. So now, of course, movies are shot with a variety of lens lengths, all kinds of things between and so on. But in general, the stylish movies of the day tend to sort of sit in one or the other of those sort of lens length ranges. And that's a pretty common thing. So this movie, the thing that makes it so interesting about this particular movie is the horror of this movie largely comes from claustrophobia, right? Like it's a movie about being trapped in a cave. So you would think, because it was about being trapped in a cave, what kind of lens package would this guy pick? a telephoto package because it compresses the space. It makes things feel like they're more pressing together. And yet he didn't shoot that way, even though, like, stylistically you would think that's the one. No, he shot on a wide lens.
Convention says do it that way, and he doesn't.
He did it on a wide lens. And why does he do it on a wide lens? So here are the reasons. The first is because a lot of the scenes of people being trapped, they actually need to crawl toward camera, right? So because they have to crawl toward camera, you need to feel like they're making progress. And if you were to shoot that on a telephoto lens, it would feel like
they were a little speck.
Yeah, it would feel like they were crawling forever and never making any progress. And you know how that would feel? Like an unending nightmare. That would be the worst feeling in the world. And it's the director understands that the audience needs to feel the relief of occasionally watching their heroines escape for a moment. And if he shot on a telephoto lens, that could not happen. So the other advantage that it gives is, obviously they didn't shoot in a cave, right? There's no way you could actually make this movie in a cave. It's not possible because it would be incredibly dangerous, and because you would have to either make these pathways or find them, and that would take years in itself just to find all these little pathways to shoot these scenes. Can you even imagine? That'd be a nightmare. The danger's the real reason, but also just the inefficiency of time and money is another. You couldn't get power down there, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, to make a movie like this, you have to build a set, right? You have to build a set, which means that because the guy shot this on a wide lens, he is able to use production design to limit or compress the field of view more. And so that's a director who understands he's got two pieces to use to tell the story of these people being trapped under the rocks. There's the part that's the camera part, and then there's the designing the set part. And he decided, what I'm going to do is I'm going to design these little narrow spaces and shoot it all on a wide lens, and it's going to feel like the claustrophobia is the same as though it was telephoto, but it's not. And that's a director who knows his craft. That's a smart decision.
And it works in simpatico with lighting, though I'm sure you're going to talk about that, so I'll shut up.
I have a whole... Definitely. I have a whole thing with that.
Yeah. This is all working in the old Abe brain.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad. So the other thing that the wide-angle lens allows him to do is, and it's subtle, but if you watch the film, there's actually a fair number of tiny little dolly moves. Like you can actually get on a tiny little dolly, like maybe it's something as small as a speed rail, and slightly move in camera, which adds to the tension as they're crawling toward us. Again, if you were on a telephoto lens, you would not feel that move.
No.
That move would be invisible, which would mean you're basically always on a static camera. And for this movie, that's a mistake, because once the monsters, the cave goblins, what are they actually called? Crawlers? Is that what they're called?
Crawlers is, I think, the term that's used.
Well, I'm going to call them cave goblins because that's what they are.
Yep.
So
they're little cave Nosferatu.
They really are. Yeah, that's exactly what they are. So once the cave Nosferatu show up, then, of course, the director has to use a more traditional sort of fractured editing and filming style to make them scary. Because I think if you just saw them, if you saw like lots of wides of them, you would feel like, so he kind of shows little pieces of them, which is a standard horror trope. But that doesn't really work if the first half of the movie is this standard postcard telephoto shooting, and then I got to cut to all this frantic editing when the monsters show up. That would feel like two movies.
Dude, I just think I don't know if I'm 100% on this, but I'm pretty sure one of the main filmmakers that made telephotos a thing is... the Davids, Danny Boyle and David Fincher. Sorry, both of those guys use on 28 Days Later, and on Fight Club. There's a lot of telephoto work.
But he doesn't work exclusively.
That just occurred to me.
He doesn't work exclusively.
It's not
does
exclusively.
He? Yeah.
It's not, because I find that directors will like make a choice like I only shoot it on a 35.
Yeah, right.
But rarely do they say like I'm going to shoot it on an 85, because telephoto I think is just used less.
It's
just
harder
like,
to work with. You have to.
It's harder to work with. Yeah,
you have to have a lot of distance.
Have a very specific, and you don't get geography as much. You don't get like all the reasons you're saying, it's tough to think of a movie that is like exclusively long lens. It makes me really want to make a telephoto movie.
But I would love to see you do that. That
just occurred to me because I was just thinking of, as you were talking, I was thinking of different random shots they do. I know 28 Days Later definitely uses long lenses and stuff.
More long lenses for sure, and it works with the handheld too.
Yeah, exactly.
So, just briefly, here a couple other things that the lens choices work. So, one of the scary things about the cave is being trapped, right? We've talked about how the wide-angle lenses have helped with that. The other thing about the cave is sort of the unending abysses, right? These giant black abysses. That's another reason why you want to have a wide lens package, because it gives you the sense of like, my God, it's like this gigantic dark kingdom in here. And there's a number of times they cut to a wide like that, and the wide angle lenses really sell the abyss of it all, right? So that part's good. Now, by contrast, when we're topside, which is the first like 20 minutes of the movie and the last like 5 minutes of the movie, when we're topside, though we do cut between a variety of lenses, we're largely on a telephoto lens or a longer lens on the topside. And I have a theory about this. I think that the topside is filmed in this sort of unattractive way to make it feel less jarring when they take the plunge into the cave. Because I think that it's a little bit of a tough story sell that they would all do this. And because they've made because he shoots the Earth, like the regular Earth, in a long sort of murky telephoto lens, it feels less inviting to be there. And therefore the caves become more interesting visually than they should have been, because he makes regular planet Earth look shitty a little bit.
Right.
And he does that in other ways too, but that's his lens choices help that work.
He does it in an interesting way. I noticed, and I hope I'm not stepping on your toes.
No, go ahead.
That I noticed he's super saturated in those sections.
Yes, he is.
And it's almost off-putting, because I remember the forest stuff. It's like the forest isn't that particularly lush, but he upped the greens so much.
Yes, he did, and the blues.
That it's like, that feels weird. And so it's like, even though it's more saturated in what we'd expect out of vibrant colors, it kind of has this weird isolating effect where it's like, this isn't real.
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah, good catch.
Well, so let's jump in, because that actually brings up a whole other point that I was going to do last, but let's bring it up now, because I think it's this is the perfect time for it. So the second way that the director uses what you might call practical decision making is with color. So there are people like Pedro Almodovar, right, who use color in this very expressive, artistic way. Or even like Wes Anderson, I would say, uses color in a very expressive, artistic way.
For all you Pedro fans out there, baby.
Yeah, all you Almodovar heads.
We're outing you right now. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot of directors who are quote unquote artists, like who use color expressively. This director is using color in a very functional way to help us to number one, impart that sense of this whole thing feels not real, which is absolutely true, and number two, to give us just very simple emotional connecting points to help tell a story. So the first is the color blue, and I'm going to include a little bit of green, but it's mostly blue. And he basically shows topside almost exclusively in blue. There's very few other colors than blue. And it's a very murky, unattractive blue, like a cold blue. And in combination with the telephoto lens, it creates this sense of the world being sort of indifferent and scary. And I think it helps to sell the idea that they need to take this trip, because you need the change, right? Like Sarah's world is very fractured and broken, and remains that way. I'm going to say remains that way permanently, basically, but at least the idea of this cave trip should be a fix for it, but even though it doesn't. So I think, again, the director's just making a simple decision. We're going to tell a blue story because that makes this whole thing feel a little less inviting, and you feel the coldness and you feel the detachment because of it. Now, again, that's a little bit of a sort of counterintuitive decision, because if you're making a horror movie, you would think that you would want to sort of make the status quo a more attractive place, and then they go into the cave and it's like, oh, spooky cave, right? And he doesn't really do that. He kind of makes the whole world. He sort of washes the whole world in this unattractive malaise, and I think that's just an interesting decision that makes us not question the world as much. It makes us accept the world more than we would have. Like, I can't say that this is true for sure, but imagine if he'd made, like, the top side just like this really poppy, attractive world up there, and then, you know, 3/4 of the way through the movie, you're watching these cave goblins. I think there's a chance you might be like, this movie's stupid. You know what I mean?
Most definitely.
Yeah. I mean,
it would feel out of tone. It would feel like the tone is off.
Right.
Is what color would. Yeah, discrepancy of color like that. Like, it's crazy how much of a tempered hand all directors have to be with color palettes, because even the slightest, like, you love it when, like, a Wes Anderson or someone who's, like, so good with color palettes.
Yeah, he's great with it.
That and following the rules, where he picks like 7 colors and it's in all scenes, and there's never a scene or a shot that doesn't have at least like 3 of them. And it's like, well, shit. When you have control on that level, that is attainable. Getting that and forcing that through, you know, lying, cheating, and stealing to tell the truth, essentially, which I think is a Godard phrase, or Godard saying. The idea that he's working with less than optimal budgets, he's working on stage for a lot of it, so there's elements of control. But, like, he's swinging for the fences on, like, making the underground topside, like, interplay.
I agree.
Work.
It's a hard thing.
I'd say for the most part, it's a success. I think you're right about that.
It's not an easy decision. It requires a kind of, like, you have to have a high floor as a director to make that work. There's a lot of ways.
Vigilance.
Yeah.
It's just vigilance.
There's a lot of ways you could make a mistake, for sure. And he does a really good job of sort of effortlessly seaming these two worlds together, because the truth is there's actually 3 worlds, in my opinion. There's the top side, there's the caves, and then there's, like, the caves plus the goblins. Because I would say,
like, when it's particularly tense or something.
Well, I just think the goblins sort of introduce a whole other sort of evil kingdom thing, and he has to kind of.
What would that be? Green?
Well, we'll talk. Yes, a little bit. But we'll talk a little bit about that. But his next
is the color of their little lights. Yeah.
Yes. So the second color that he uses, and again, this is not a profound decision. Underground is basically red. It's basically red there the entire time, and it starts from the moment they light the first flare, and lasts to the very end, all the way through the blood pools and everything else. Right. So. Red is kind of the most obvious thing you could pick for underground, because the obvious connotations of hell, torture, envy, all the things that are going on in this movie. It's a simple decision, but it does reinforce those things. And not coincidentally, Juno is primarily dressed in red, and she's the villain. She's the one with the betrayal.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
That's nice.
I mean, and again, the director he does put a little bit of red here and there. He puts some red on Sarah's helmet, I believe, to sort of make it feel like less of a choice. But it's clear that she's sort of the demonic figure of this group, right? And he picked red because it makes it look like a hellscape. Duh. Right. And also it makes but the really smart part about it is that it sort of marries this goblin world with the caves by giving it a sort of blood tinge. Because, there's moments toward the end of the film where you're like, literally, they're running through like a swimming pool full of blood. Like, it's just like a soup of blood. It's a lot of blood. And I think that would feel very stupid if it hadn't already been soaked in red the entire time. Right?
Yeah.
So again, that's a director finding a way to seam together these elements with one big creative decision that kind of takes some of the edge off those transitions and makes it feel like all the same world.
Did you see Ready or Not?
Yes, I did. In fact,
That pissed me off about that movie.
that
Talk about lack of vigilance and color
they
palette.
got all red toward the end.
And now we're in this, and I just like it felt wholly unmotivated. It's almost, I thought it was just because they're like, how cool would it be if she's like in
Like
her
a
wedding
blood red?
dress and
Yes.
like completely bloody,
Yes.
right? That's cool,
I thought
right?
the same thing.
And I'm like, yeah, that is kind of cool, but also like, but why? I mean, are we just playing like I thought of an image? Let's like think how cool this image is. I guess that's movies, but I don't know. I like different types of movies.
I personally don't like movies that like expect you to honor a premise that they don't actually believe in. And so
Yeah.
Ready or Not didn't believe that, like, what if we just had rich people hunting a person was enough. So they had all this like bargain with Satan stuff that was really stupid.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, just make them hunt because they're just terrible rich people. What's wrong with that? That's a fine movie. Like, so I agree. Also, the blood.
In any case,
Right, the blood bride thing. So this movie also did that, and it's very clear to me.
right? That's what it made me think of it.
It's very clear to me that like horror filmmakers feel like I got to find my own Carrie. Like I got to make my own Carrie.
I gotta find a costing image.
Yeah, but it's basically always Carrie, and I don't know why we are so obsessed with that. But this movie did a better job of doing it in a not stupid way.
Right. Because
By sort of de-emphasizing that decision. You know what I mean?
and just the idea that when you're watching it, you're like, oh, this entire sequence is bathed in green,
Yes.
or like
Yes.
you're thinking about it in the back of your head, even if you're not actively thinking about
Right.
it. You feel the presence of strong color palette choices, as opposed to neutral choices.
Or
This is not a neutrally chosen color palette film.
it's one very strong choice that blunts a lot of other choices. And again, that's why I would say it's not actually that artistic of a choice. It's a little bit more of a practical choice because it's sort of about it's about taking away questions, taking away objections. Like when you make everything one color or one style, what you've said is everything that doesn't belong in this one style is not important. And I think that this director understood, like, to make this work, I have to eliminate the difference between the pools of blood and the caves themselves. Like, I just need to get rid of like all those bone masses. They all got to feel like the same place, and that's it. It's one place. And I think that's really interesting and smart and very fun. So the last color that he uses, and you brought it up a couple of times, so is green. He uses green a few different times, always to indicate a kind of delusional mania, right? So the first time we see the green sort of saturated point of view is when after the accident that happens. It's the inciting incident of the film.
right.
Sarah has
yeah.
Sarah has that vision, right, where she's like running down a dark hallway and can't quite get away.
Yeah.
And it's in green. And we return to it like once or twice, but we don't really return to it until the very end with a couple of other women whose names I don't even remember. I just remember they were lovers. That's the only thing I remember.
It's
not Beth, it's not Juno, it's not Sarah.
It's not Beth. Sam. I think it's Sam.
It's
and
not Holly either. I don't. It's like I know all their other names. I just don't know those two.
Jessica.
You could say any name, and I'd say yes.
Yeah. You could say any. No, it's it's. There's something I did want to say in a previous section.
Hit it.
I thought he did a smart thing. Because he knew that we were going to have this problem. Because first off, it's a very dark film.
Very
and
much.
By dark film, I don't just mean darkness in terms of the the topics, but it's chiaroscuro, to use the term, like where it's almost like little puddles of light, because you have to get away from the idea that technically this is all just lit in one little space near, like she's covered in rock.
Exactly.
And she just has a torch, or she has like a glow stick equivalent flare, and that's all we see. So it's these little tiny pockets of light, and sometimes that makes people all look the same. So Neil Marshall did a very interesting thing, which I thought was kind of smart that I picked up on, which is that he gave all the characters very different accents.
Oh, interesting. There you go.
So that you could tell them apart.
Yeah.
And even after doing that, I still have problems. Other than like Beth, Juno, and Sarah, I have a problem
And-
remembering like, who's Sam again? Oh yeah, that was Sam. That was Sam, right? Or was that Rebecca? I can't remember. Maybe it was
Rebecca
Holly.
one of them?
Yeah.
I don't even know. I have no
Yeah,
idea.
it was a Rebecca. Yeah,
I didn't. I couldn't remember their names. I could only remember the names of the ones that held
Right.
emotional value. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, Rebecca is the one who gets dragged back and eaten alive as Juno runs.
no,
So she's literally just like she's literally
goblin
there
fodder.
just to be
Yeah,
eaten.
goblin fodder.
Yeah, exactly.
So they also had to have somebody die by a goblin crawling upside down in the stalagmites or whatever.
Ooh,
yeah, I love that
Love
too.
it.
So, okay, so the green light. So the green light
Mm-hmm.
is, I think it serves two functions. And they're not sophisticated. They're very simple.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is to sort of create the feeling of an eerie, otherworldly, unnerving thing, which is kind of how we feel about green light anyway. Right? It's a very simple experience. So there's that. And it does the second thing of sort of distinguishing between the groups of women when we sort of separated and they're being hunted down individually by all the goblins. You have Sarah, whose face you recognize, and you have Juno, whose face you recognize, and then you have the other two who are still alive, and they're holding a green flare. And so it's sort of a director doing two very functional things with one decision. It's, hey, things are getting crazy, and they're sort of they're hearing things they don't like. It feels like a vision almost. But also, I know when I cut to them which scene we're in, because this one's the green one, the other one's the red one with Juno, and then there's the red one with Sarah. So I instantly know where I am. And it becomes really important to know where you are if you're going to try to do any narrative storytelling with three people in a black, unknown geographic space. You know, and that's just smart, functional directing. And because of that, I'm able to track all three of their journeys. So I'm not confused. Right. So, you know, again, is it a Junot decision? No, but it's functional and it works. And it gives rise to the very last thing I wanted to talk about. Unless you wanted to interject.
Well, I wanted to see what your thoughts on. It's not like I got an axe to grind, but it reminds me of a story this movie makes me think about. Like, so light is how the medium of photographs,
right,
especially taking photographs at 24 frames a second. That's how that works. It's literally photons hitting a film medium or, a chip sensor. And so you need light to make pictures,
Truth.
Right? And so anytime, like, movie Pitch Black, I'm reminded of, like, anytime there's a movie where it, like, literally someone in the beginning of the movie says, like, there's no light down there because we're underground and there's no access to daylight, and so it's pitch black. There are scenes where, there's no motivated light.
Right.
Because, like, a light goes out or something like that. And so you should just be looking at a black frame. But that's not how we do movies, obviously. I remember having this debate when I was director of photography on Kill Me Now with the director.
Yeah.
Where I was just like, I need to do like this, like when the lights turn off in the house because the killer cuts the power. Like I have to design a
night light
look that, and then I have to design a look on top of that that's like the actual lit, so that I can go from one stage to another. And he was just like, and we just didn't have enough time, and he was just like, I think we can just play it with no lights. And I was just mad.
Can't see anything.
So mad. I was so mad. He was just like, we'll do it as a bit though. It will be like a bit where we just have an audio play. And I was like, that's the only thing. I was like, all right, man, okay. But I was still like, we'll make it work. But I was just so mad. And it's true. It's true. Like, he had to do that a few times in this movie where you're like, where's your light coming from? And our buddy Michael Cox, a very talented director of photography.
Yes.
He always tells the story about David Lynch talking to his DP, because David Lynch is he's not Cinema Verite or Dogma 95 or anything like that, but he's very like wants everything to be motivated and have a reason. And he asked his DP at one point, as the story goes, he was like, what, he didn't like that, and I think it was like Twin Peaks or something like that, and it was like a woods scene, like at night. He was like, I don't like that there's like multiple moons. Like, what is that light over there? Like, where is that light coming from? And his DP, it was just frustrating. He's like, the same place your music's coming from, David. Which is just, it's all fucking make-believe. It's
None
just
of
like,
this
I
is
love
real.
the idea.
None of it's real.
None of this is real. Stop it. Stop it. Just stop it. I need the light. So just, for all the things that we like give credit and tip the hat to these directors for doing these very, vigilant choices, we have to remember that sometimes there is no motivation, and sometimes you just have to be okay with that, because you don't have to, like when you're working with an actor, you don't have to go into a scene and say, the reason I feel like you would come to camera and grab the water is because at this time you'd be doing this in your head. No. Why? Because you need to come to the camera to
right, because I need that to happen, man.
Because I want
what
it
can
to
I
happen
say?
for camera.
Yeah.
And then you tell that to actor, and the actor's like, oh, okay, yeah.
Right.
It's just like, stop inventing reasons. Right. If there is no reason, sometimes that's okay.
Well, again, the audience is not dealing in abstractions with how a scene was formed if you're telling your movie well. They're not thinking a single thing about that. So it's your brain is exactly where I wanted it to be, because the last point I wanted to make was about story motivated lighting. I think that's actually one of the genius things about this premise, aside from, I don't know how everybody else feels, but to me, being trapped in a cave is like one of the most terrifying things I can imagine. Yeah, and I actually think the movie gets less scary when there's goblins, personally, than when they're just trapped down there.
That's great.
That's my opinion, but I don't think everybody thinks that.
Well, I mean, I think at this point, these goblins are, like, we've seen a lot of monsters in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, and these ones are fine.
These ones are fine, but it's not like it was like blowing my mind of like, look at these fuckers.
No,
like we've seen.
They're a guy in a costume.
TV does this all the time. Yeah. It's just guys in costumes.
Yeah. It's not a particularly inventive beast, but nonetheless, I'm willing to. I was willing to accept that, and I think most people are. So, but the other genius thing about this premise, as a horror premise, is that for the most part they did kind of stick with motivated lights. They brought down
for the most part.
Brought down flares and flashlights, and it's a thing in video games all the time. But like when you don't see everything, when your the narrower you can make the field of view, the more effective it is as a horror story, because everything that you're afraid of is the thing right out of view. And this movie, because of them only having those lights, does a pretty great job of just sort of gently doing horror stuff just by the situation they're in. It doesn't do a lot of stupid lighting. It doesn't do a lot of stupid lighting.
It's motivated, or it just needs to be there, and it's not loud and in your face and like trying to be stylized for no reason.
And that's where the color palette really, again, reinforces the story. Motivated lighting is like, because it's like, look, the color's gonna be red because that's the color the flares are, and because the color of the flare is red, we kind of get away with lighting it in a way that couldn't actually happen, because this is one big bright light source, and it's how people feel about flares, and it works. It's very effective, and it's not like that's the only way that this could be done. Like, there's a lot of ways this could be done that would be less effective. We just watched a movie last night called Dragonheart, and they had that scene down in the cave where, like
a film called Dragonheart. Like
people don't know.
Everyone hasn't. People don't know what Dragonheart is.
Then what the hell are you doing in this place?
Sean Connery and Dennis Quaid. Yeah. I'm Draco.
He's such an affectionate.
I'm going to become a star.
He's a very affectionate dragon.
He really
is.
A
very soft-hearted dragon. Anyway, so they have a cave scene in it, and the cave scene is lit in such a worse way. And I'm not saying that to disparage anybody, but like, they clearly lit the back of the cave and stuff so you can see it. And then they have the torchlight, and it's just like, we want you to be able to see in this cave. We don't want you to have a horror experience. and it just sort of makes the whole thing feel like it's on a stage. Right? It really does. Whereas this thing had the burden of, like, we got to make it feel like it's not on a stage, because it is on a stage, but we got to make it feel like it's not. And because there's only these very few story-motivated lights, it saves them all kinds of time and money on their production design. Right? Like, the production designer can put up a wall of foam, and you don't know what the fuck it is, because they've washed it over in, like, a slimy finish, and they mostly don't light it. You know what I mean? So, like, production design gets to be smaller and smaller and smaller, and it saves them time and money because of the story-motivated lighting. Which that sounds...
Sometimes lighting well is lighting less.
Yeah, and also, this isn't a movie that had $1 billion. This movie had to be made on a budget, and that's how you make those kind of decisions creatively to get the movie done. You know, because...
It's also... It occurs to me also while you're talking about it that something that they talk about in a lot of movies is eye light. A famous case is, if you remember you probably don't remember because you don't give a shit about this stuff, but in like around the same time, there was like 2005, I believe they did the reboot of Battlestar Galactica.
I have seen that.
And they actually like, I think fired the DP of the first season and brought a new guy in because the original conception of it was to be so documentary style that all the lighting had to be like practical and you do 180s, and you see that in the first season.
And it was a mess.
It becomes more of a traditional show after that. And it's, it's still handheld, but it's less of that like sweeping direct documentary style. And it's because they realized that in those emotional moments, one of the very important things to a lot of people is eye light. Eye light is, that little ping of light that is in the eye that lets you like kind of connect to characters because it makes them feel like they're alive. And and often if you don't have eye light, they look dead and soulless because it's more akin to reality, because people aren't always looking at light sources, and that's how you
it's
get
one
that.
of the reasons
so they found clever ways to do that. And in this film, I think that he found moments where it's like, this is where we need to connect, so I'm going to make her hold her her torch there,
totally,
so that the bounce is the light and we catch her eyes. But in these scenes, in these shots, don't need to care about the eyes.
100%.
I don't need to always be there, and that's very tempered because a lot of people are going to be like, where's the eye light? It's like, man, she's tromping through a cave, like, how am I going to fucking get an eye light?
And they're pretty economical about having dialogue scenes in like spaces that they can light more traditionally. Like a lot of the dialogue happens in
where they're standing.
When they sort of like, this is our little oasis spot where there's a little more light. Maybe there's a shaft of sunlight here, and like, so that they can do a better job with it. But when they're just sort of crawling around yelling stuff, it's like, your eye isn't even necessarily attracted to their face. It's like that rock up there. You're like, like.
There's going to be something.
Yeah, I mean, and it really works. So the other thing about the story-motivated lighting is it's the only way to make these cave goblins as scary as they need it to be. You mostly have to have them in the dark, and somehow a flashlight on them actually does enhance their scariness because they're a little reflective. And they actually, I don't know if you read this, but like there was a point in time where they were talking about having sort of like glow in the dark, like bioluminescent components to the goblins, and I think they did that, and then they realized that you needed to see less of them, and so they changed it.
Probably.
So that again, like this is a storytelling decision, and it's a budget cut decision, but it sells the monster better.
Yeah, I think of Attack the Block.
Yeah, I love that movie.
Have you seen that movie? Yeah.
That's interesting.
They did the similar thing with the monsters where they literally don't reflect light.
I mean, and I think in general we're all a little like, ugh, by anything that doesn't reflect light. It's just sort of a natural human feeling. By the way, you mentioning Battlestar Galactica made me realize Battlestar Galactica is a show that's largely telephoto. as is The Shield. Both of those shows that were shot in the same way.
Yeah, the TV, especially during this era, went crazy for, and maybe that was it. Maybe that's why film started to do it, because we love the documentary style, The Office, all the single camera like comedies that were coming out at this time. We're all aping the doc style with handheld camera, Parks and Rec, you know. And because of that, I think they were using longer lenses because people would actively be zooming in and stuff like that, because it's more like run and gun. You feel like you're more a fly on the wall. And those longer lenses, I think, evoke that feeling of like not being in the scene as
like
much.
Like a spy camera a little bit. Like it's a voyeuristic camera. That's also true. So what does this all add up to? So on the one hand, I feel like I'm kind of giving both credit and sort of not credit to this director. What I want to definitively say is these decisions are the decisions of a person who knows how to use the medium to tell a story and knows how to focus on the main things, right? And all of these decisions are sort of movie-wide decisions that help smooth over problems that could come up in the audience's mind and gives him the ability to make the movie on the budget that he has and to allow the other departments to focus on the very narrow, specific look they're going to do. These decisions probably saved art and camera a ton of money and made them a lot more creative and limber. And they kept objections from the mind of the audience, because again, the audience likes to object to horror movies, right? Like it's a thing for people to watch horror movies and laugh at them, right? And this one doesn't happen because he removed objection points with a pretty silly premise, really. You know, like there's really no reason we needed cave goblins down there at all. But it's a movie, and that's what he did, and it works because he made a lot of choices on the front end to make that decision work, and it worked. So, you know, that I hope has been a good illumination on how some of the basic craft elements of directing help to make a movie work. And how this movie got better because the director got kind of out of the way in some ways. So that's it. That's my pitch.
You know what? I give you 5 out of 5.
Ooh.
I don't know if we're supposed to rank these, but
5.
you know, I'm making that canon for this one. No, I think that's very well said. I think there's a lot of work that went into this film that I was like, oh, that's sleepy. That's a little sleepy smartness. Yeah. You know, like you know how they're sonically. That's how they like kind of understand.
Yes.
They're bat-like, right? And I knew that, and this is my second time watching the movie, so I remember it's like the bat-like creatures, and I remember the little Nosferatus, so it's already like vampires in my brain. And then I forgot that at the very top in like Act 1, there's like 2 or 3 times like bats come out of shit, and you know there's that one thing where like Juno's going like 1, 2, 3, but and stuff like that, and it's like, oh, you're literally talking about like doing a bit with little Draculas.
That's right.
You know,
that's right.
So it's like not that he gets, the writers get points for like doing that. That's not like, oh, that's so choice, but it's just you start to realize that when you know, it's like walking into a house and you realize that, oh, these floorboards are nice. And then you look over and go, that wall is like well made, and then you realize this is a really good house. You know,
yes.
It's like
that's exactly it. That's how I felt when I watched this. Was like, hey, like each little piece of this is pretty good and like not getting in my way, and then suddenly at the end of the movie, you're like, hey, that was a pretty good movie. I totally agree.
And doesn't get a lot of I think that is the type. That's why. Like, I think another way to think of this podcast sometimes is like Abe and Adam's version of like cult movies that either are or should be cult movies.
Yes.
You know?
Should be
like,
appreciated.
Movies that are supposed to be appreciated for what they are. And what they're not is, you know, everyone like masterpieces. None of them are like masterpieces.
We don't because like it's easy for me to tell you, listen, I don't know if you know, The Godfather's a good movie. It's like, yeah, duh.
The Shining.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, no, it's this is a smaller, humbler film.
Right.
And you're right about the limber. I'm a huge fan of like the limberness you're talking about, like being nimble as a production team to get the stuff that you need it's so important to the work because it's about keeping the story in view always, which means that you need to be focused and making in a world that doesn't have nearly enough control to begin with. Filmmaking, you lose control so easily.
Absolutely.
And so to be able to make decisions, like systematic decisions that are like, this is our approach.
Right.
To make sure that you have built in some form of platform of control is so important. And then once you have that limitation, like in your head and everyone knows and the whole team is like basically seeing the vision of what this type of production is, now you can actually get creative. Like when we talk about artists who are just like jazzing it up or something, or just like, I don't know, I just kind of feel like maybe if I tried this, and then they go, that was an inspired decision. That often comes from, in the same way that like music, you know, you get the good microphones and like, you go to Capitol Records and you get the musicians there, and then it's just like, all right, today we're just going to play because we already built the scaffolding for you to like be there doing it. We're recording it. It's going to sound great. Just have fun with it. That's as close to, like, to me, that's as close to this filmmaking and storytelling's like the artifice aspect of it. Because there's also the creative like influences in like what the films are doing and what they're trying to say and what it says about society. All these things are great things. They're important things, if not the most important.
100%.
But when it's getting down and actually doing the work, it's about being tempered in this kind of forge that is production gathering, you know, physical production.
It's funny how you this director piece is definitely born of the way that I made movies at Cracked. Like when you said that at the beginning, I was like, yeah, he's right. I do make a lot of practical decisions as a director. And like I recognized my own. I was like, this guy's doing exactly what I would do if I didn't have enough money, or if I was limited in money, and I had to make decisions to make it feel artistic, but not actually be that artistic of a decision. Because I did that many times, as did you. So game recognized game, as they say. Right?
Yeah. Neil Marshall.
Yeah, he did great.
Gamer.
Yeah. He did great. He did very good.
Yeah. And I think that's why he's so lucrative on TV, because TV is, like 11 pages a day at some point.
Right. I think that's I think that working with mass quantities of film in a day, working on a schedule like that makes you good at doing like sort of broad strokes decisions that are clear. Like it's really good about making you prioritize. Look, I don't have the time to get like the exact cool point of view shot I want of this. But you know what I do have time to do? I can paint all these walls green and you're going to get the vibe that I want. And exactly. Look, that's the craft. Most of us, I have not yet. Perhaps fortune will smile on me, but I have not yet been given the $50 million movie that is with infinite time to make the way I want. You know what I mean? I haven't been given the Eyes Wide Shut picture yet. Right. But if I ever do, hopefully I deliver at that level artistically, but it will be a different experience than what directing has been for me and for you, right? Have you ever had that kind of luxury?
No. But as they say, even if you have fuck you money, it's still going to be not enough, or it's not enough time. It's always going to be a balance. But this type of thinking is what makes the balance work for you, as opposed to against you. And I think that's well said.
Well, thanks again, Neil Marshall. Thank you, The Descent, for a very palatable horror film. And thanks to my forever bud, Abe's, for being...
Hey, thank you for calling me out and telling me thanks.
I've also decided to just start greeting you with a lot of my tweets. Like you're just gonna start getting tweets that aren't about you, but you're just gonna be
noticed. Just
and also, hey, buddy.
Yeah, I've noticed. No, man, this is good. I like this one.
Cool.
This one's good. Yeah.
So
all right.
if the audience liked it, they should mosey on over to our Small Beans Patreon and drop a couple of bucks if they'd like, and they will get access to some of our exclusive content that gets released early, right?
If you don't have the scratch, because I know everyone's, dealing with, life right now, feel free to jump on iTunes and give this 5 stars if you can, or appropriate number of stars. But the 5 stars really help Small Beans get out there and get on more eyeballs, which means more people listening to this, which means more content, and just the myriad of shows that we have. We'll make more. We'll have more.
We love doing it.
That's the idea, and we love it. This is so much
Agreed.
fun. Until next time.
Adios.
This has been a Small Beans endeavor. We're a bunch of pals who make podcasts, sketches, music, web series, and movies. The Beans always have new ideas percolating, so make sure to check us out at patreon.com/smallbeans. That's patreon.com/smallbeans, where you can browse all of our current and past content, see what we've got planned in the future, and learn how your support can help the Small Beans grow into huge, giant monster beans. If you enjoyed this content module, please like, rate, subscribe, or tell a friend about us. We love you!